On a frozen Montana ridge beneath a pale winter sky, a Navy SEAL opened his cabin door to a sight that stopped his breath. German shepherds lay broken in the snow, blood darkening white drifts. One great dog rose, pressed its paws to its chest, and pleaded without a sound. If this moment touches your heart, type Amen in the comments, and let faith, compassion, and second chances speak louder than the cold. Winter had settled deep into the mountains of Montana, not loudly, but with the quiet certainty that came after years of knowing how to claim the land. Snow lay heavy across the pine slopes and the narrow dirt road that twisted upward toward a single wooden cabin, softening edges, swallowing sound, turning the world into something pale and hushed. The sky was a dull, colorless gray, the kind that made time feel suspended, as if the day itself had decided to hold its breath. Inside the cabin lived Jack Miller, a retired Navy SEAL in his late 40s, a man whose broad shoulders and angular face still carried the unmistakable marks of military life. His hair had gone prematurely streaked with gray at the temples, cut short out of habit rather than regulation, and a faint scar traced along his jawline, a quiet souvenir from a mission he never spoke about. Jack's eyes were a steady steel blue, alert even at rest, but worn by years of watching danger arrive without warning. He lived alone by choice, though the truth was more complicated than that. After leaving the service and losing his wife, Emily, to a sudden illness that took her before apologies could be spoken or futures imagined, Jack had retreated from people with the same discipline he once used to clear rooms and follow orders. He was not unkind, but he was distant, polite but closed, a man who believed that solitude was safer than attachment. On that winter evening, the cabin was warm with the steady crackle of a wood stove. Jack sat at the small table near the window, his hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug of black coffee gone cold. Outside, snow fell in thick, lazy spirals, tapping softly against the glass like fingertips asking questions he had learned not to answer. He had spent the afternoon splitting firewood, his muscles aching in a familiar, grounding way that reminded him he was still useful, still capable of enduring physical strain even if emotional weight remained harder to lift. As dusk deepened and the forest darkened into shadow, the world beyond the cabin seemed to vanish, leaving only the sound of wind moving through branches and the low hum of the stove. Jack rose from the table to add another log to the fire when he heard it, a faint, irregular sound cutting through the quiet. It was not the wind, nor the groan of settling wood. It was softer, more deliberate, a brief scrape followed by a pause, then another. Jack froze, his posture instantly shifting from relaxed to alert, every instinct honed by years of training snapping into place. He listened again, his breathing slow and controlled. The sound came once more, closer now, right at the door, as if something or someone were standing just beyond it. He did not reach for the rifle mounted above the fireplace. Instead, he moved toward the door with measured steps, placing his hand against the solid wood, feeling the cold seep through the grain. When he opened it, the sight before him stole the air from his lungs. The porch and the snow-covered ground beyond were scattered with shapes that did not move at first glance, dark against the white, unnatural in their stillness. German shepherds lay sprawled across the snow, their thick coats matted with ice and streaked with dried blood. Their chests rose and fell faintly, unevenly, proof that life had not yet left them, though it lingered by the thinnest thread. Jack's first instinct was disbelief, his mind struggling to reconcile the scene with logic. He had seen dogs before, plenty of them, both in training and in the field, but never like this, never abandoned in such condition, so far from any town or road. As he took a step forward, his boot crunching softly into the snow, one of the dogs moved. It was a large male, taller than the others even on all fours, his frame powerful despite the exhaustion that bent it. Slowly, with effort that seemed to drain the last of his strength, the dog pushed himself upright onto his hind legs. His front paws came together against his chest, not stiff or aggressive, but pressed inward, almost clumsy, as if mimicking a gesture learned by watching humans from afar. His eyes, a deep amber flecked with dark gold, locked onto Jack's face, and in that gaze there was no threat, no wild hunger, only a raw, unmistakable plea. Jack felt something inside him crack, a fracture so sudden it startled him more than any ambush ever had. He had faced men who wanted him dead, had made decisions in seconds that altered lives, but nothing in his training had prepared him for the sight of a wounded animal standing in the snow, silently asking for mercy. His heart pounded hard against his ribs, not with fear, but with an ache that reached back through years of buried grief. He thought of Emily, of the way she used to stop on the side of the road to help injured birds or stray dogs, how she believed that kindness was never wasted, even when it hurt. Jack swallowed, his throat tight, his breath visible in the cold air. He scanned the rest of the dogs more carefully now, noting the tremor in their bodies, the way one female lay curled protectively around two small pups barely old enough to hold their heads up. Another dog's leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, while a younger one lay alert despite his wounds, eyes tracking Jack's every movement with sharp intelligence. These were not feral animals. These were trained, disciplined, and broken. Jack felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders, the same weight he had carried overseas when civilians were caught between forces they never chose to fight. He took a step back toward the doorway, then stopped, doubt rising like a wall. He had built his life around avoiding this exact moment, the moment when caring meant opening himself to loss again. He was tired of funerals, tired of goodbyes, tired of the way love could be taken without warning. For a heartbeat, he considered closing the door, convincing himself that nature would take its course, that someone else would find them, that it was not his burden to carry. The thought did not last. The large dog's legs trembled and he dropped back onto all fours, clearly near collapse, yet his eyes never left Jack's. There was trust there, fragile and dangerous, offered without guarantee. Jack exhaled slowly, feeling the cold burn his lungs, and in that breath he understood something he had tried to forget. Walking away had never truly saved him before. He stepped fully onto the porch, the wind biting at his face, and opened the door wider, letting the warm glow from inside spill across the snow. The dogs did not rush him. They did not bark or bare their teeth. They waited, watching, as if understanding that this was the moment everything would change. Jack's voice came out rough, unused to speaking aloud after so much silence, but steady. "All right," he said quietly. The words meant as much for himself as for them. He gestured toward the light and the heat beyond the threshold, toward the space he had guarded so fiercely for so long. "All right. Come inside." The warmth inside the cabin felt almost unreal after the bite of the mountain cold, as if Jack Miller had crossed some invisible boundary not only of space, but of fate. Snow clung to his boots and melted into dark patches on the wooden floor as he moved slowly, deliberately, guiding the injured German shepherds inside one by one. He worked without panic, relying on habits built during years of combat medicine training, his movements steady, his voice low and calm, the way it had been when fear threatened to take over men far younger than himself. The dogs did not resist. They followed his gestures with exhausted obedience, as though they recognized authority not in force, but in intention. Jack laid old blankets and spare jackets near the wood stove, arranging them close enough to share warmth without crowding, aware that sudden heat could shock bodies already pushed to their limits. The first dog he helped inside was the large male who had stood on his hind legs outside. Up close, Jack could see the full extent of his condition. The dog was massive, well over 90 pounds, with a thick sable and black coat dulled by grime and ice. His muzzle was scarred along one side, a pale line cutting through darker fur, and his ears bore small tears at the edges, marks of past fights or harsh training. Despite his injuries, his posture carried a quiet authority, the kind Jack had seen in seasoned team leaders who spoke little because they did not need to. Jack knelt with some effort, his knees stiff from the cold, and gently pressed a hand to the dog's shoulder. The muscles beneath trembled, but the dog did not flinch. "You're the leader," Jack murmured, surprising himself with the softness in his voice. "I can see that." The name came to him without thought. Max. The dog's ears shifted slightly, and his eyes remained fixed on Jack's face, unblinking, as if memorizing it. One by one, Jack brought the others in. A female with a lighter tan coat and expressive brown eyes limped badly on her rear leg, her movements careful and protective. She was smaller than Max, her frame lean, almost elegant, and despite her pain she kept turning her head to check on the two small pups pressed close to her side. Jack noticed how she placed her body between them and any perceived threat. Even now, even here. "Easy," Jack said quietly as he guided her toward the blankets. "You're safe." The name Bella suited her, not because of appearance alone, but because of the gentleness in her gaze, the kind of quiet strength he remembered in nurses and caregivers who carried suffering without complaint. Another dog followed, darker in color, with a broad chest and a stiff, guarded way of moving. His eyes were sharp, constantly scanning the room, missing nothing. There was tension in him, the posture of a sentry who had learned the cost of inattention. Jack recognized that look instantly. "You don't stand down easily, do you?" he said. "We'll call you Duke." The dog lowered himself to the floor only after Jack stepped back, never taking his eyes off the door. Two more dogs came next, both male, younger, though still fully grown. One had a reddish tint to his coat and an alert, restless energy that had not yet been beaten out of him despite his injuries. He paced in a small circle before settling, ears twitching at every sound. Jack named him Riley, sensing a spark of resilience there. The other was quieter, heavier in build, with a graying muzzle that suggested he was older. His breathing was labored, but his expression carried patience rather than fear. Sam, Jack decided, because there was something familiar and dependable in the way the dog accepted help without pride. Last came the pups. They could not have been more than a few months old, their coats still soft and uneven, their bodies light enough that Jack could lift both at once. One was mostly black with oversized paws that promised future size, the other tan with a white patch on his chest. They whimpered softly, not from hunger alone, but from confusion, their world reduced to pain and cold too early. Jack placed them beside Bella, watching as she immediately drew them close, her nose brushing their heads in reassurance. When all were inside, Jack closed the door and slid the heavy bolt into place. The sound echoed in the cabin, final and deliberate. For a moment he simply stood there, hands on the door, breathing slowly. The room smelled of wet fur, wood smoke, and iron, the metallic tang of blood faint but unmistakable. He turned back to the dogs and felt his chest tighten as he saw their collars more clearly in the firelight. Each bore a deep indentation around the neck, some raw, others scarred over, the unmistakable mark of metal restraints worn too long, too tight. These were not stray animals. They were prisoners. Jack fetched his old first aid kit from a shelf, the same one he had carried into the mountains years ago and never quite trusted himself to throw away. He worked carefully, cleaning what wounds he could, wrapping cloth where possible, murmuring reassurances he did not know he still had in him. The dogs accepted his touch with a trust that unsettled him more than aggression ever could. As he worked, memories pressed in, uninvited. Faces of men he had patched up under fire, the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that sometimes survival depended on who happened to be nearby when everything went wrong. He had walked away from that life believing he had nothing left to give. Now, surrounded by these broken animals, he realized how false that belief had been. Miles away, down in the small town nestled at the base of the mountain, Mary Thompson stood alone in the quiet sanctuary of a modest white church. She was a slender woman in her early 70s, with neatly combed silver hair pulled back into a low bun and a face lined by years of gentle smiles and private sorrow. Widowed more than a decade earlier, Mary had learned to carry loss with grace rather than bitterness. Her blue eyes, pale but sharp, reflected a deep faith that had sustained her through nights of loneliness and days of service. That evening, as she finished setting candles along the altar, a sudden unease settled over her. It was not fear, exactly, but a persistent tug at her thoughts, drawing them upward toward the mountain. She clasped her hands, her skin thin and cool to the touch, and whispered a prayer, not knowing why the image of a solitary cabin and a man she barely knew filled her mind. "Watch over him," she said softly, "whoever he is, wherever he stands." Back in the cabin, Jack finally sat back on his heels, exhaustion creeping into his bones. He looked around at the dogs now lying close together, their breathing steadier, the firelight reflecting in tired eyes. Max shifted forward and, with effort, lowered his large head to the floor directly in front of Jack's boots. He did not look away. His gaze was steady, open, unguarded. Jack met it and felt a quiet understanding pass between them, something unspoken but clear. Trust had been offered, freely and without condition. Jack nodded once, a small gesture, but one that carried weight. "I won't fail you," he said, the words forming before he had time to question them. Max remained there, calm and watchful, as if the matter were settled. Morning arrived slowly in the Montana mountains, not with light, but with a subtle thinning of darkness that turned the sky from black to a dull, frozen blue. The storm had passed some time before dawn, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt deliberate. Jack Miller woke in the wooden chair near the stove, his body stiff, his neck aching where sleep had claimed him without permission. He had not planned to stay awake all night, but old instincts had refused to let him fully rest. Every unfamiliar sound, every shift of wind against the cabin walls, had kept one part of his mind alert. The dogs lay scattered around the room, closer together than before, their breathing deeper now, steadier. Max lay nearest the door, his body angled so that one eye remained open, watching the threshold even in rest. Duke was positioned near the window, head raised, ears twitching at distant sounds. Bella slept curled tightly around the two pups, her ribs rising and falling in a slow, protective rhythm. Jack rose quietly, careful not to startle them, and pulled on his boots and coat. When he opened the door, the cold hit him hard, sharp and clean, filling his lungs and clearing the fog of exhaustion. The world outside looked untouched at first glance, the snow smooth and unbroken under the pale morning light. Then Jack saw it. Near the edge of the porch, where drifting snow had not fully settled, were marks that did not belong to the mountain. Two parallel grooves cut through the white, shallow but distinct, the tread pattern unmistakable to anyone who had spent time around military transport. Truck tires. Jack followed the tracks with his eyes as they curved around the cabin, circling once before continuing toward the tree line. His jaw tightened. He crouched, brushing away loose snow with a gloved hand, confirming what he already knew. These tracks were fresh, made within the last day. Rising again, Jack scanned the ground more closely and found the second sign. Boot prints, heavy and deliberate, pressed deep into the snow, the kind worn by men who expected rough terrain and confrontation. Tactical boots, not hikers, not hunters. His pulse quickened, but his movements remained controlled. He stepped back toward the door just as Max appeared beside him, silent despite his size. The dog's posture had changed, his muscles taut, head lifted high. Duke joined them, followed by Riley, who paced in short, sharp movements, nostrils flaring. Without command or sound, the dogs took up positions, one near the window, one by the door, another watching the tree line, their coordination instinctive and unsettlingly precise. Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He had seen this before, this unspoken understanding between trained units, the way experience shaped behavior even when conscious memory failed. "You've done this before," Jack murmured, not accusing but recognizing. Inside the cabin, Bella stirred and lifted her head, eyes alert now, the pups shifting beneath her. Sam rose slowly, his older joints protesting, but he placed himself between Bella and the open space of the room, steady and resolute. These were not random animals reacting in fear. This was training resurfacing under threat. Jack closed the door quietly and leaned his back against it for a moment, breathing through the weight settling in his chest. Someone knew about the dogs. Someone had been here, and that meant the choice he had made the night before carried consequences he could no longer ignore. Down in the small town below the mountain, life moved at a gentler pace, unaware of the tension tightening above it. 12-year-old Ethan Parker walked along the narrow road near the general store, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his oversized jacket. He was small for his age, thin-limbed, with dark hair that never quite stayed combed and a face that seemed permanently thoughtful. His eyes were a soft hazel, observant and wary, the kind shaped by learning early when to stay quiet. School had not been kind to Ethan. Other boys found his love for drawing and animals an easy target, and he had learned to endure mockery by retreating into imagination. That morning, his mother had sent him out early, hoping the fresh air might lift the heaviness she sometimes saw settle over him. Instead of turning back toward town, Ethan found himself glancing up the mountain road, curiosity tugging at him stronger than caution. He had heard rumors, whispers traded between adults who thought children were not listening, talk of dogs, of a man who lived alone, of something strange happening up there. Ethan hesitated, then began walking uphill, his boots crunching softly in the snow. He did not go far, stopping where the trees thinned and the cabin came into view through the branches. From his hiding place behind a stand of pines, he watched as Jack moved around the porch, scanning the ground with careful attention. Ethan's breath caught when he saw the dogs. Even from a distance, he could tell they were hurt. But there was something else there, too. Something powerful in the way they stayed close to the man. Ethan had never seen dogs behave like that. So disciplined, so focused. He watched Jack kneel to inspect the tracks, saw his shoulders tense, then straighten with resolve. The boy felt a strange warmth bloom in his chest, an unfamiliar feeling of hope. He did not know why, but the sight of that man and those dogs together felt important, like the beginning of a story that mattered. He stayed only a few minutes longer, then slipped away quietly, deciding without fully understanding why that this was not something to share. Some things, he sensed, needed to be protected. Back at the cabin, Jack finished his inspection and stepped inside. He secured the windows, checked the old rifle mounted above the fireplace, not with eagerness, but with grim acceptance. He did not want conflict, but he would not be unprepared. As he moved, the dogs watched him closely, responding to his energy. When he finally crouched in front of Max, the large shepherd lowered his head slightly, their eyes meeting at the same level. Jack placed a hand on the dog's neck, feeling the thick fur beneath his fingers, and spoke quietly. "They're coming back," he said, not as a question, but a statement. Max did not move away. His gaze remained steady, his presence solid as if to answer without words. "We're ready." Jack straightened, looking around at the cabin that had once been his refuge and now felt like something else entirely. A line had been crossed, whether he liked it or not. He had opened his door to the cold, and with it, to responsibility. Outside, the mountain stood silent, but Jack knew better now than to trust the quiet. Someone had left their mark in the snow, and they would follow it back if they had to. As he bolted the door and turned back toward the waiting dogs, one truth settled firmly in his mind. This was no longer just about shelter or compassion. The danger was real, and it was already moving toward him. The rumors reached Officer Sarah Collins the way most inconvenient truths did, quietly and through people who did not expect to be believed. It was late morning when she first heard them, standing near the counter of the small diner across from the sheriff's office, warming her hands around a paper cup of coffee. Snow clung to the edges of the street outside, churned gray by passing trucks, while inside the diner the air smelled of bacon grease and burnt toast. Sarah listened without interrupting as an older man spoke in a low voice about big shepherd dogs up on the mountain and a quiet guy living alone who'd taken them in. What caught her attention was not the story itself, but the detail that followed. "They don't act like strays," the man said, shaking his head. "They move like soldiers." Sarah did not smile or dismiss it. She was a tall woman in her mid-30s, lean rather than delicate, with straight brown hair usually pulled into a practical low ponytail that brushed the collar of her uniform. Her skin was fair, weathered slightly by years of patrol work in harsh winters, and her face held sharp, thoughtful lines that made her look stern at first glance. Her eyes, a clear gray-green, missed very little. She thanked the man politely, left her coffee unfinished, and walked back across the street, the words settling into her thoughts with uncomfortable weight. Sarah had grown up in a military household. Her father, Daniel Collins, had served 2 tours overseas before coming home quieter than the man who had left. He never spoke about what he had seen, but Sarah remembered the way he watched doors, the way loud noises made his shoulders tense, the way he treated working dogs with a respect bordering on reverence. When she was 16, he had been killed in a roadside accident caused by a drunk driver, a loss that hardened something inside her. From that day on, Sarah had carried an unspoken rule into adulthood. If something felt wrong, you did not wait for permission to care. Back at the station, she scanned the local reports. No formal complaints. No calls logged about dogs or disturbances near the mountain. That, too, bothered her. Absence of noise did not mean absence of trouble. She mentioned the rumors casually to her supervisor, Sheriff Tom Reed, a broad man in his late 50s with a thick mustache and a habit of leaning back in his chair as if the world could be managed from a distance. Reed listened with half an ear, then waved a dismissive hand. "Mountain talk," he said. "We've got real work to do. Wolves, dogs, whatever people think they see when they're bored." Sarah nodded, but something in his tone, the practiced indifference, only sharpened her resolve. She returned to her desk and pulled up old files, her fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. There had been no official investigations, but there were gaps, places where reports stopped short, where questions had never been asked. She shut down the computer and reached for her jacket. If paperwork would not lead her to answers, instinct would. Up on the mountain, Jack Miller stood at the cabin window, watching the tree line through a pair of old binoculars he had not used in years. The dogs sensed the tension in him, responding with quiet vigilance. Duke remained by the window, Riley patrolled the length of the room, and Max sat near Jack's side, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Jack had spent the morning reinforcing locks, moving supplies, and mentally mapping defensive positions he had sworn he would never need again. Yet here he was, the soldier returning to him not by choice, but by necessity. When he heard the distant sound of an engine struggling uphill, his body reacted before his mind caught up. He lowered the binoculars slowly, eyes narrowing. A single patrol vehicle emerged through the trees, tires crunching over packed snow. Jack did not relax. Authority could mean help, but it could also mean complications. He stepped back from the window, resting a hand on Max's neck, feeling the steady strength there. The vehicle came to a stop a short distance from the cabin, and the engine cut. Sarah Collins stepped out, adjusting her jacket against the cold. She took a moment to survey the scene, noting the tracks half hidden by fresh snowfall, the way the cabin sat just off the road, secluded but not inaccessible. She approached on foot, careful not to appear threatening, her posture open but alert. Jack opened the door before she reached it, the dogs visible behind him, their presence undeniable. Sarah stopped a few feet away, meeting Jack's gaze evenly. He saw immediately that she was not here to posture. Her expression was serious but not hostile, curiosity tempered by caution. "Jack Miller?" she asked. Her voice was calm, professional. "That's right," Jack replied, his own voice steady. "Officer Sarah Collins," she said, gesturing briefly to her badge. "I heard some things that didn't sit right with me. Thought I'd see for myself." Jack considered her for a moment, weighing instinct against experience. He nodded once and stepped aside, allowing her a clear view inside. Sarah's eyes moved quickly, taking in the dogs, the bandages, the way they watched her without aggression but with unmistakable awareness. She felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the same one she used to feel when she visited her father at the base kennels as a child. These animals had been trained, used, and then discarded. "They're not strays," she said quietly, more observation than accusation. "No," Jack answered. "They're not." Sarah crouched slightly, keeping her movements slow. Max watched her closely, then did something that surprised her. He shifted his weight and sat, still alert, but no longer tense. It was a measured response, deliberate. Sarah exhaled softly. "Someone's been looking for them," Jack added. "Truck tracks, tactical boots." Sarah straightened, her jaw tightening. That confirmed her unease. She knew what it meant when trained assets went missing from illegal operations. Someone would want them back. She met Jack's eyes again. "I don't have anything official yet," she said. "But I'm not ignoring this." There was no promise of backup, no assurance of swift justice, only resolve. Jack recognized that look. It was the same one he had worn when orders failed to match reality. Sarah stepped back toward her vehicle, pulling her gloves on. "I'll be back," she said. "And next time, I won't be alone." She paused, then added, "You did the right thing." As she drove away, Jack closed the door slowly, the weight of her visit settling over him. Outside, the engine noise faded, swallowed by the mountain. Inside, the dogs relaxed only slightly, returning to their watchful positions. Jack rested his forehead briefly against the door, then straightened. Someone else knew now. Someone who would not look away. And that, he realized, changed everything. The afternoon light never truly arrived in the mountains that day. Only a dim silver glow that hovered behind thick clouds, casting long shadows across the snow. Jack Miller felt the shift before he saw it. Years of training had taught him to recognize the subtle changes in the air, the way silence tightened when something moved against it. The dogs sensed it too. Max lifted his head first, ears forward, body rising with deliberate calm. Duke followed, muscles coiling beneath his dark coat, while Riley's pacing stopped abruptly, his attention snapping toward the tree line. Jack stood from the table, every nerve awake, and moved toward the door, his breath slow and measured. Outside, the wind carried a low rumble, not thunder, but engines straining against the incline. Through the narrow window, Jack spotted movement between the trees. Figures emerged one by one, dark shapes against the white, moving with purpose rather than hesitation. There were 5 of them, all dressed in heavy winter gear, faces partially covered, weapons slung casually but ready. At their center walked a man whose presence set him apart even at a distance. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a rigid posture that spoke of command ingrained deep into muscle and bone. His beard was close-cropped and flecked with gray, framing a hard mouth set in a thin line. Even bundled in layers, there was no mistaking the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. Jack recognized the type instantly. This was not a desperate scavenger or a frightened trespasser. This was a man who believed he owned what he came to reclaim. Inside the cabin, Bella drew the pups closer, her body low and tense, while Sam positioned himself beside her, a silent wall. Max stepped forward until he stood between Jack and the door, his stance firm, unyielding. Jack placed a hand on Max's back, feeling the steady strength there, then reached for the rifle mounted above the fireplace. He did not rush. He checked the chamber, familiar motions grounding him as the memories he tried to outrun settled back into place. The men stopped several yards from the porch, spreading out slightly, practiced and cautious. The leader raised a gloved hand, signaling them to wait, then stepped forward alone. His eyes, pale and calculating, fixed on Jack as the cabin door opened. "Afternoon," the man called, his voice even, almost polite. "Name's Cole Bennett." Up close, Jack could see the lines etched into Bennett's face, the kind carved by years of harsh decisions and a lack of regret. There was an old scar above his left eyebrow, jagged and white, and another along his neck that disappeared beneath his collar. This was a man shaped by violence, and more troublingly, comfortable with it. "You've got something that belongs to me," Bennett continued, glancing past Jack at the dogs inside. "Those shepherds, they wandered off. I'm here to take them back." Jack stepped fully onto the porch, placing himself squarely between Bennett and the doorway. He was taller than Bennett by a few inches, broader through the chest, his own face weathered but composed. "They didn't wander," Jack said calmly. "They were dumped, and they're staying." Bennett's mouth curved into something that resembled a smile but never reached his eyes. "You don't understand how this works," he replied. "Those animals were trained, expensive, dangerous in the wrong hands." His gaze flicked briefly to Max, who stood motionless behind Jack, eyes locked on Bennett with a focus that made one of the men shift uneasily. "They're not dangerous," Jack said. "They're injured, and they're done being used." For a moment the wind was the only sound, snow hissing softly across the ground. Then Bennett's expression hardened. He lifted his hand again, and the men behind him began to move forward, nets and restraints visible now. Inside the cabin, the dogs reacted instantly. Duke lunged toward the door with a deep, resonant bark, Riley joining him, their voices sharp and coordinated. Max stepped past Jack, placing himself at the threshold, his body a solid barrier, teeth bared not in frenzy but in warning. The sound echoed across the clearing, powerful and unified. At the edge of the trees, unseen by any of the men, Ethan Parker crouched behind a fallen log, his small body shaking despite the layers he wore. He had followed the tracks earlier, curiosity and concern outweighing fear, and now he watched the scene unfold with wide, terrified eyes. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure someone would hear it. Every instinct told him to run, to hide, but he stayed, rooted by something he did not yet have words for. This was courage, he realized dimly, not loud or reckless, but standing firm when walking away would be easier. Bennett's men advanced another step. Jack raised the rifle, angling it upward, his fingers steady on the trigger. "This is your last warning," he said, his voice cutting through the noise, controlled and cold. "Leave." Bennett hesitated, assessing the situation, weighing risk against pride. He made a small gesture, and one of the men lifted his weapon slightly. That was enough. Jack fired a single shot into the air. The crack of the rifle split the silence, snow cascading from the branches as the sound echoed down the mountain. At the same instant, the dogs erupted. Max's bark led the charge, deep and commanding, joined by Duke, Riley, and Sam, their voices merging into a wall of sound that vibrated through the ground itself. The effect was immediate. Bennett's men faltered, surprise flashing across their faces as the dogs surged forward to the edge of the porch, not attacking, but holding their line with unmistakable force. Ethan flinched, hands clamped over his ears, then looked up just as a new sound cut through the chaos. A siren. Distant at first, then unmistakable, growing louder as it wound its way up the mountain road. Red and blue lights flashed through the trees, reflected in the snow like fractured stars. Bennett swore under his breath, his jaw tightening. He took a step back, then another, signaling retreat. "This isn't over," he said, his eyes never leaving Jack's. "You've made a mistake." Jack did not answer. He stood his ground, the rifle lowered but ready, the dogs unwavering at his side. The men withdrew quickly, melting back into the forest as the sound of the approaching patrol vehicle filled the clearing. Ethan sagged with relief, tears freezing on his cheeks, the weight of what he had witnessed settling into his young chest. As the siren drew closer, Jack finally exhaled, the tension easing just enough to remind him how close the line had been. He looked down at Max, meeting the dog's steady gaze, and nodded once. The danger had not passed, but for now, they had held. The patrol vehicle reached the clearing just as the last of Cole Bennett's men disappeared into the trees. Their retreat hurried and uneven. Snow billowed behind the tires as Officer Sarah Collins stepped out, her boots sinking deep into the drift. Her posture was straight, controlled, but her eyes moved quickly, taking in every detail. The rifle still in Jack Miller's hands, the dogs standing in a tight formation at the porch, the fresh boot prints cutting away into the forest. Sarah's brown hair had come loose from its tie during the drive, strands brushing her cheek, but she ignored the cold wind tugging at them. Her face was set in a way Jack recognized immediately, focused, alert, and carrying the quiet anger of someone who had arrived just late enough to see the damage, but soon enough to prevent worse. She raised one gloved hand toward Jack, palm open, not in command, but acknowledgement. "You okay?" she asked. Jack nodded once, lowering the rifle slowly. "We are," he said. "For now." Behind Sarah, another officer climbed out of the vehicle, older and heavier, with a thick neck and ruddy skin weathered by decades in law enforcement. His name was Deputy Mark Willis, a man known around town for his caution and his preference for clear evidence over instinct. He surveyed the scene with a skeptical eye, then frowned at the tracks leading away. "That wasn't a friendly visit," he muttered. Sarah crouched near the snow where one of Bennett's men had slipped, brushing aside loose powder to reveal a dropped object half buried beneath ice. She lifted it carefully, a black plastic ID badge with no name, only a faded logo and a serial number scratched partly away. Her jaw tightened. "This isn't random," she said quietly. "This is organized." Over the next hour, the clearing filled with the methodical movements of investigation. Sarah photographed the tire tracks, measured boot impressions, and recorded Jack's account without interruption. Jack spoke plainly, without embellishment, the way he had learned to debrief after missions. He described the dog's condition, the marks around their necks, Bennett's words. Sarah listened, her expression darkening with each detail. She had suspected as much, but suspicion and confirmation were different things. Down in town, as the afternoon wore on, Mary Thompson knelt in the small church, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The sanctuary was quiet except for the faint creak of old wood and the low hum of the heater. Sunlight filtered weakly through stained glass, casting muted colors across the floor. Mary's eyes were closed, but her brow was smooth, the tension she had felt the night before easing into something like peace. She did not know specifics, did not see flashing lights or hear sirens, but she felt a subtle warmth settle in her chest, a certainty that the prayer she had whispered had not been lost. "Thank you," she murmured softly, her voice steady. Back on the mountain, Sarah's investigation moved quickly. By evening, she had driven back down to town, the ID badge secured in an evidence bag. She went straight to the county building, bypassing the front desk and heading for records. Hours later, with files spread across a metal table, the pattern emerged. Private security contracts, training facilities listed under shell companies, missing permits, names repeated in places they should not have been. One name appeared more often than the rest, tied to approvals that bypassed normal review. It belonged to Councilman Robert Hale, a broad-faced man in his early 60s with silver hair always neatly combed and a reputation for keeping things running smoothly. Hale had built his career on favors and quiet influence, presenting himself as a harmless local official while turning a blind eye to operations that brought money into the county. Sarah stared at the documents, her pulse steady but fierce. This was not just about dogs. This was about corruption protected by respectability. She did not sleep that night. By morning, warrants were signed, backed by evidence she had assembled piece by piece. Deputy Willis, now fully convinced, joined her without hesitation. Together, they led a small team to a warehouse on the outskirts of town, a structure disguised as a storage facility. Inside, the truth was impossible to deny. Rows of reinforced kennels, restraint equipment, training logs documenting methods designed to break and control. The smell of disinfectant barely masked the deeper scent of fear and neglect. Officers moved through the space in silence, their expressions grim. Several men were arrested without resistance, including Bennett, found supervising preparations to relocate remaining animals. Councilman Hale was taken from his office later that afternoon, his protests falling flat against the evidence stacked neatly in labeled folders. Up on the mountain, Jack waited. The dogs remained close, their vigilance unwavering. When Sarah's vehicle finally appeared again, climbing the road with purposeful speed, Jack felt a tension he had carried for days begin to loosen. Sarah stepped out, her face tired but resolute. "It's done," she said. "The operation is shut down. They're in custody." Jack exhaled slowly, the breath trembling as it left him. "And the dogs?" Sarah's expression softened. "They're free," she replied. "Legally. No one can claim them." Jack looked down at Max, then Bella and the others, seeing the subtle shift as if they sensed the change before he did. Shoulders eased, tails lowered. A quiet settled over the cabin that felt different from the silence before. Not empty, but complete. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Mary Thompson lit a candle in the church, its small flame steady against the dim. She smiled to herself, a gentle, knowing smile, and whispered a prayer of gratitude for lives spared and truths brought into the light. Back at the cabin, Jack sat by the fire, the dogs resting nearby, and allowed himself, for the first time in years, to believe that the worst had passed. The weeks that followed unfolded quietly, the kind of quiet that did not press down but slowly lifted, as if the mountain itself were exhaling after a long-held breath. Snow still lingered in shaded places, but the air softened, and the sun began to linger longer on the cabin roof, melting ice in steady, patient drips. Jack Miller woke each morning with a sense of purpose he had not felt in years. The dogs were no longer temporary guests, no longer a crisis to be managed. They were part of the rhythm of the place now, woven into the daily life of the cabin as naturally as the crackle of the stove or the creak of floorboards. Sarah Collins had offered to connect Jack with established shelters, reputable ones with resources and staff. But Jack declined without hesitation. He thanked her, his voice sincere, but the decision had already settled in him. These dogs had been passed from hand to hand, treated as tools, assets, problems to be solved. He would not send them away again. Instead, he began to change the cabin and the land around it, not dramatically but thoughtfully, with the same care he once applied to planning missions. He cleared space beside the cabin, erecting simple covered runs from salvaged lumber, sturdy enough to withstand winter storms. Inside, he converted a storage room into a warm recovery area, lining it with clean straw and old mattresses. The work was hard, his muscles protesting each night, but the ache felt honest, earned. Max watched everything from his chosen place near the front steps, his posture upright, his gaze sweeping the property with calm authority. He did not bark unnecessarily, did not chase shadows. Visitors learned quickly that Max's presence was not aggressive, but absolute. He was the gatekeeper, the silent signal that this place was protected. Bella adapted differently. She moved slowly now, her limp less pronounced, and gravitated toward people rather than space. When Mary Thompson began visiting regularly, bringing homemade soup or fresh bread, Bella would settle at her feet, resting her head against Mary's thin ankles. Mary, her silver hair tucked beneath a knitted hat, would smile softly and stroke Bella's ears, murmuring stories from her past as if speaking to an old friend. Mary was a slight woman, her shoulders narrow but straight, her hands marked by age and work. There was a gentleness to her movements, but also resilience, the kind that comes from enduring loss without surrendering kindness. Bella listened as if she understood every word. Duke and Riley took on roles of their own. Duke remained vigilant, often patrolling the perimeter with measured steps, while Riley's restless energy found direction in training exercises Jack reintroduced gently, emphasizing trust rather than control. Sam, older and slower, preferred to lie near the porch, content to watch life unfold, his presence steady and reassuring. The pups grew quickly, their clumsy paws turning confident as weeks passed, their eyes bright with curiosity rather than fear. And then there was Ethan. The boy appeared one morning at the edge of the clearing, uncertain, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. He had grown braver since that day in the snow, though his frame remained slight, his movements cautious. His dark hair fell into his eyes as he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I heard you might need help," he said, not looking directly at Jack. Jack studied him for a moment, seeing not weakness but a quiet strength waiting for permission to surface. "We always need help," Jack replied, his tone warm. Ethan began coming by after school, learning how to refill water bowls, brush coats, and clean bedding. At first he spoke little, flinching at sudden noises, but the dogs responded to him with patience. Max acknowledged him with a steady look. Bella allowed him to brush her gently. The pups climbed into his lap without hesitation. Slowly, almost without noticing, Ethan's shoulders straightened. His voice grew firmer, and his laughter, soft at first, began to surface. Jack watched this change with a mix of pride and something deeper, something that tightened his chest unexpectedly. He did not offer advice or lectures. He simply worked alongside the boy, answering questions when asked, demonstrating through action rather than words. In doing so, he became something he had never planned to be. A quiet guide, a steady presence, a father figure not by title, but by consistency. Sarah visited occasionally, always professional but increasingly relaxed, her posture less rigid when she stepped onto the porch. She approved permits, helped navigate legal details, and ensured everything was documented properly. She smiled when she saw how the dogs responded to Jack and Ethan, how the space had transformed. "You built something good here," she said once, her gray-green eyes reflecting approval. Jack only nodded, uncomfortable with praise but grateful nonetheless. One afternoon, as the snow receded further and the ground began to show patches of dark earth, Jack brought out a rough wooden plank. He worked on it quietly, carving letters with careful precision. Ethan watched, fascinated, while Mary sat nearby, Bella at her feet. When Jack finally lifted the sign and mounted it at the edge of the property, the words were simple, burned deep into the wood. Second Chance Ridge. The name felt right, not grand, but honest. As the sign settled into place, A breeze moved through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and thawing earth. Max took his position beneath it, sitting tall, his silhouette framed against the mountain beyond. Jack stepped back, his hands resting on his hips, and took in the scene. The dogs moving freely, Mary smiling quietly, Ethan laughing as the pups tumbled around him. For the first time since leaving the service, Jack felt something settle inside him, not an end, but a beginning. The cabin was no longer just a place to hide from the world. It was a home, open in a way he had once believed impossible. The mountain no longer felt like a fortress holding its breath, but like a place learning to rest. Snow retreated day by day, pulling back into the shadows beneath trees and the low places where winter always lingered longest. Jack Miller sat on the front steps of the cabin as the afternoon light softened into gold, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands loosely clasped. The air carried the scent of damp earth and pine sap, a quiet promise of seasons moving forward. Around him, the dogs lay scattered in comfortable familiarity. Bodies relaxed, eyes half closed, no longer listening for threats that might come at any moment. Max lay closest, his large frame stretched along the edge of the porch, chin resting on his paws, amber eyes watching the distant tree line out of habit rather than fear. Bella rested nearby, her breathing slow and even, while Duke and Riley dozed in the grass beyond the steps. Sam slept deeply, age finally granting him peace, and the pups chased each other in short bursts of clumsy joy before collapsing into the shade. Jack watched them and felt the quiet settle into his bones. It was different from the silence he had sought after leaving the service, the kind filled with avoidance and isolation. This silence was full. It held laughter, breath, and the simple certainty that nothing needed to be proven. He thought of the years he had spent believing survival meant shutting parts of himself away, locking doors not just against danger, but against connection. War had taught him discipline, endurance, and loss. It had taken friends whose faces he still saw in dreams, and a future he once imagined with Emily. It had taken his ease with people, his trust in permanence. But sitting there now, feeling the sun warm his face and the solid presence of Max at his side, Jack understood something he had never allowed himself to consider. War had not taken everything. It had not taken his ability to choose kindness. Down in town, Mary Thompson sat in the front pew of the small church, her posture upright but relaxed, her hands folded loosely in her lap. The sanctuary was brighter now, spring light filtering through the windows and softening the edges of the worn wood. Mary's silver hair framed her face, her skin pale but glowing with health, her eyes clear and calm. She listened as the organ played a gentle hymn, not loudly but steadily, filling the space with warmth rather than grandeur. Mary smiled, a small, private expression that came from deep within, the kind that followed prayers answered not with spectacle, but with peace. She did not need to see Jack or the dogs to know that something good had taken root. Faith, she had learned, often worked quietly, changing lives without asking for acknowledgement. At the same time, in a modest bedroom overlooking the town's main street, Ethan Parker sat cross-legged on the floor, a sketchpad balanced on his knees, his brow furrowed in concentration as his pencil moved with careful purpose. He had grown in recent months, not much in height, but in presence. His shoulders no longer curved inward as sharply, and his eyes lifted more often to meet the world rather than retreat from it. On the page before him, a picture took shape. A man standing beside a group of dogs beneath a wide, open sky. The lines were simple, but confident. The man's posture was steady, protective, not towering but grounded. The dogs leaned toward him, connected by something unspoken. Ethan shaded the sun last, placing it high above them, its rays reaching down in long, deliberate strokes. When he finished, he sat back and smiled, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. He did not think of it as art. He thought of it as truth. Back at Second Chance Ridge, Jack rose slowly from the steps and stretched, feeling the familiar pull in his muscles, but also a lightness he had not known before. He walked to the edge of the porch where Max lay and knelt, placing a hand on the dog's broad head. Max lifted his gaze, meeting Jack's eyes with the same steady attention he had offered on that first night in the snow. Jack's fingers moved through the thick fur, warm now, healthy, alive. He remembered the weight of the rifle in his hands, the sound of gunfire, the faces of men he had lost. He remembered nights when sleep would not come, and mornings when purpose felt out of reach. And then he looked around at what stood before him. A place reclaimed, lives restored, a future unfolding not from force, but from care. "You know," Jack said quietly, his voice carrying only as far as the porch and the listening ears beside him. "I thought I was the one who pulled you out of the cold." Max's ears shifted slightly, attentive. Jack smiled, a small, genuine expression that softened the hard lines of his face. "Maybe we saved each other." The words did not echo. They did not need to. They settled into the space between man and dog, into the land itself, becoming part of what this place was now. As the sun dipped lower and shadows lengthened across the grass, the dogs gathered closer, instinctively forming a loose circle around Jack. There was no command, no signal. It was simply where they chose to be. And Jack, for the first time since the war, did not feel the need to stand guard against the world. He sat among them, breathing in the evening air, letting the day end as it wished, certain at last that some things could not be taken, no matter how hard life tried. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or bright signs in the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, in the form of a door opened on a cold day, a wounded soul asking for help, or a heart that chooses compassion when it would be easier to turn away. God's work is often found in these small moments, where love is chosen over fear and mercy over indifference. In our daily lives, we may not face mountains or storms like Jack did, but we all meet moments that test who we are and what we believe. When we choose kindness, when we protect the vulnerable, when we refuse to look away from suffering, we become part of that miracle. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what this message means to you. And subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, healing, and second chances. May God bless you, guide your steps, and watch over you and your loved ones every single day.